I think we'll run out of atmospheric space far before we'll run out of fossil fuel.
In a way, we are shifting problem from one commodity to another because even for EVs, we need lithium batteries. And lithium is still a non-renewable resource.
Thanks for bringing Karl Marx and Ambedkar both in the argument together simultaneously. Bengaluru has also an interesting history with energy. The Shivasamudram hydroelectricity plant in the early 1900s was one of the first of its kind in India and Asia. And energy started to flow to the Kolar goldfields and come to Bangalore city itself, which transformed the city. Some of the first street lights were lit up in Bengaluru. Electricity was used to pump water to the city, and water pumping allowed the city to grow in the 1900s. So water was pumped from 24 kilometers. Currently, water is pumped from 100 kilometers and about 300 meters below. Thanks to energy, the city keeps going. The city is also $350 billion in GDP, if you have some numbers. And of course, it's 14.5 million people with livelihoods, education, everything going on. Without energy, the city does not hum. But we're in the era of climate change and global warming. So therefore, we have two experienced practitioners who are studying climate change, who are working on energy issues. Dr. Tejal Kanitkar is a professor in the Energy, Environment and Climate Change program in the School of Natural Sciences and Engineering at the National Institute for Advanced Studies, NIAS. She's a mechanical engineer by training and has worked in the area of energy and climate studies since 2006. That's quite some experience. And her research interests lie in the area of energy development and climate policy. And particularly of interest is the focus on equity and justice, which is one of the dominant ways of seeing that you bring to the energy policy. Rajesh Hegde has an MSc in chemical engineering with combined industry experience of over 8 years in Canadian oil, right? So you're a Canadiga and also a Kannadiga, so that's nice. Yeah. And an emission reduction assessment for low carbon technologies, right? So he's currently a climate writer, scaling up his self-publishing platform, Climate Rubik, for impact and traction, and the Rubik comes from the Rubik cube, and you're trying to solve the jigsaw puzzle which climate change is, right? So pleasure to have both of you here, and hope to have this conversation on energy and the city of Bangalore. Just to demystify for us, Dr. Tejal, what does climate change and what does energy consumption mean from a Bengaluru city perspective, also from a global perspective?
Yeah. I think one of the real problems of the entire issue of climate change is that it has forced us to think differently from how we have thought of pollution in the past. Pollution is a local problem, and it appears locally, manifests locally, and we also have local solutions, local responses to it. Climate, unfortunately, is caused, one of the main greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide, which has not been thought of as a pollutant and is not, in the local sense, a pollutant. It is a problem when there is a larger concentration globally in the atmosphere. And so, therefore, the impacts that we feel of climate change locally, we feel the impacts locally, of course. Flooding, we feel locally, we feel heat locally. But they are not necessarily caused by local emissions. Emissions in the United States, emissions in Europe, and emissions not just today, but emissions over the last over 150 years of industrialization have led to the problem of climate change. So that makes it a far more complicated problem to respond to as compared to pollution. So when you sort of bring the problem down to the city, any city in Bengaluru for that matter, it becomes, you start thinking of what do you do at the level of the city. It is important to remember, however, that while everybody must do whatever it is that we can, and given that Bengaluru is, you've already mentioned, is a growing city, 14 million is more than many countries in terms of size of population. It's growing also, especially So there is something that we should do right at the outset. The way in which the city is planned, the way in which amenities are planned to be provided to people, all of these things must be thought about. But it must be remembered that not all of it necessarily can be solved at the level of Bangalore.
Right.
There is a larger issue which is not just at the level of the state of Karnataka or the level of India, but also at a global level. And all of these must be understood in their interconnected nature.
Broadly, we would understand it from a city perspective as mitigation and adaptation at a simplistic level, right? So your point that is being well made out is that mitigation is a smaller component, which a city has a small role, but has a role. But mitigation is also about global efforts that have to be. But adaptation has to be local because we are given this card that we've been dealt with without asking for it. And what does adaptation therefore mean in terms of policy thinking, in terms of planning, especially for the most vulnerable who have to bear the brunt of that adaptation? Something on that.
Right. So adaptation has, and again, it also complicated by the fact that where does development stop and where does adaptation begin has always been very difficult to define. So a lot of vulnerability is really situated in lack of development. Vulnerable sections of the city, the poor, the working classes of the city, and a whole lot of other sections of the population that are vulnerable for various reasons are not necessarily, one aspect of it is the hazard, the impact of climate change. But the vulnerability itself stems from socioeconomic reasons. So that's the first step of building climate resilience, is to build socioeconomic resilience amongst people. Make sure that there is decent work, and that work is not precarious. So that is, of course, the first step. And there is all the basic things that we have spoken about in terms of amenities: water supply, sanitation, housing, mobility. All of these things are necessary for reducing vulnerability, irrespective of whether you feel climate impacts or not.
Right.
Even regular weather variability is something that people find hard to cope with, especially vulnerable sections of the population. Small issues such as major illnesses, accidents, etc., can set people back years in terms of poverty. So even before the problem of climate change begins, you have this entire aspect of vulnerability to resolve. Over and above that, then, you have the impacts of climate change, which are becoming increasingly more frequent as well as more intense, and which will continue to do so. So then you have to plan. There is an additionality to the development. You can't build infrastructure the same way in which you would have otherwise. Take electricity infrastructure, for example. Given that you are going to see, it is cheapest to have electricity lines overhead. And for a developing country, for a resource-constrained economy, that is cheapest option is usually the best option. However, given that you will have larger losses in terms of lines going down because of extreme weather events, extreme rainfall, etc., it makes sense to then have underground lines. That means more money. That additionality then would mean adaptation. What you would have otherwise done anyway. Provision of electricity is necessary anyway. But now you have to make sure that electricity is resilient to the impacts of climate change, which adds an additionality in terms of cost, in terms of technology, and a whole lot of other things.
Perfectly put. So you hear the socioeconomic argument, Rajesh. How would you sort of look at it from your perspective, your experience, and what is the insights that you have on how we are to respond to climate change, and how do we respond to energy consumption that the city puts on the system?
Yeah, so my focus since I worked in the oil and gas industry in Canada, so I have some kind of insider knowledge of how much the effects of oil and gas and plays on the environment and on energy density. So through my climate communication or to my website, I'm focusing on energy transition. And since the mainstream discussion is on moving away from fossil fuels to renewables, it's not a one-to-one replacement. So I'm focusing on why it's not a one-to-one replacement.
And why is it not a one-to-one replacement?
In multiple ways. So one is the renewables are not as energy dense as fossil fuels. So if we want to move to renewables, we have to reduce our per capita energy consumption, especially in the upper middle class and above. So, and that is a very uncomfortable proposition to the people in the upper middle class and also to people in the developed countries, especially. So, and that will also preserve the carbon budget so that the developing countries can develop without the carbon budget being too consumed by the higher economic strata in the developing and the developed countries. So I'm focusing on analyzing these aspects, and so I'm just trying to see or kind of communicate to people that like all the features of the energy transition, what are the complexities, the challenges, and how kind of a optimum energy mix moving forward, which is again not, there's no silver bullet. It's kind of a dynamic situation.
Right. So I just want to push this argument a bit further. There is therefore these investments which are happening in renewables, for example, solar, and cities adopting it at large scale. How important is the pricing issue in the whole energy basket?
Yes, definitely pricing. When you talk from an electricity production perspective, like dollar per megawatt hour, the renewables cost is going down for solar and wind with time because of economy of scale. Still, if you see from a power density perspective, like power produced divided by the land area used to produce that power, like a spatial power density, renewables have much lower power density than fossil fuels. Even hydro has a very low power density. So that it becomes kind of an elephant in the room or hidden elephant in the room. So which I'm trying to bring. Yeah.
The trade-off between land use and energy generation, which comes.
Yes.
One of the dreams that was told by Renewable Energy for a long time is that it could be decentralized, that you could generate, you could become a prosumer, you could produce and consume. Yes. Is the dream not viable at a city scale when you consider the city of Bangalore?
It is partially viable. Right now, everywhere rooftop solar is going up. So, and also net metering is coming along with it so that you can supply back the power to the grid. But still, most of our energy consumption comes from mobility and other consumeristic activities. So, in that way, still a residential component is still a small component. But yeah, we can fill up through decentralization and grid storage. But yeah, we still, again, my recurring theme is reducing the per capita consumption of the affluent class. Yeah. So
can I add to this a little
bit? Please, you should. You should.
Yeah. No, the targets that India had for solar, part of it was supposed to come from rooftop solar, decentralized rooftop. But there have been challenges, and even for residential or commercial buildings where it is possible theoretically to have it, you need to connect to the grid. You need some storage. So either you have storage or you connect to the grid. So the grid acts as a battery. However, for grid operators themselves, this can be a challenge.
Yes.
They need to maintain the grid frequencies and to manage multiple, intermittent units coming in and out can create problems for grid operators. So they have been reluctant for a very long time to be able to do it for good reasons. It is fine to set targets and expect people to meet those targets. However, you have to actually operate the grid. It can become a challenge. This is true also for solar pump sets, for example, not just for solar rooftop. And the question of cost is not just also about area, I think, because once you add storage to the mix, the cost is still not, there is still not parity in terms of cost. There is, of course, the costs have gone down significantly. Even 10 years ago when we were looking at projected costs, we couldn't project the kind of reductions that we have seen in the costs of solar particularly. And that is because of economies of scale, as Rajesh mentioned, and largely because of the scale of deployment that has happened in Asia. India and China in particular. China, of course, takes a large share of it. So this is largely driven by increased deployment in developing countries, and there is a cost, however, that consumers have borne for doing this.
Dr. Tejal, I just want to bring focus again to one of your arguments, which perhaps I may be summarizing wrong, but you can correct me. You would say that there still is space for the poor and the vulnerable to actually assert their right to a carbon space which they have been denied, and that development and therefore the movement away from vulnerability, if it means that you have to capture your fair share of the carbon, historic as well as current, should be one of the focuses of design of urban areas. Would you agree that that is one way of looking at it? We have been so far focused on simply moving away to renewables as our only response to carbon emissions. But we've somewhere forgotten this aspect of how do we develop, how do we become less vulnerable? Your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that's a wrong summarization at all. While the carbon budget argument has been used at the global level, because you have a global carbon budget, apportioning it at the national level is possible because the boundaries make much more sense. Subnational boundaries are much more fluid, and so apportioning a carbon budget becomes a little bit more difficult at that level. But the entire argument is that the poor, who have not historically emitted, who have a right to development, and we do, if we agree that there is, except for a few countries, the United States being the major one, that doesn't agree to the United Nations Declaration on the Right to Development, all others do agree. And if there is a right to development, then that means a right to healthcare, a right to education, right to housing, a right to well-being, basically. And there is no evidence that renewable energy, you need energy to be able to provide a lot of these things. There is no evidence that renewable energy can do all of it immediately. Maybe eventually, because you can build a building that uses less energy, so is more energy efficient, you have better ventilation and things like that, and that can then be run on renewable energy. But to build the building itself, you need fossil fuels. So that you cannot do, and so we still have a lot of infrastructure yet to be built. And that must be, of course, there is a fight to be had domestically in terms of who benefits. If you do get your fair share of the carbon space, who benefits from it? Is it the poor? Is it the vulnerable within your country? But that is a fight to be had domestically. If developed countries grab all of the remaining carbon space, then you don't even have space to have that fight domestically because you've lost a fight internationally.
So then just to push this argument further, if the poor have to assert their right on fair energy, which sectors, would the sectors of housing and mobility, that is transport, be the crucial sectors that we look for in terms of equity and energy together?
Yes, not just that. I mean, there is also domestic energy. So you have domestic energy is people need to have energy to be able to, and that is both in terms of embedded energy, right, in terms of infrastructure, and the energy that is actively used by people, right? The reduction of drudgery inside the household is driven by appliances that use energy.
Yes.
So, and all of these great advertisements that we see now on sharing the load, it's all right to share the load in terms of men and women both doing the washing. That was never there if you had to wash your clothes by hand.
Right.
It's fine to start a washing machine. Men can do it, women can do it. But you need a washing machine to be able to share the load. So it's not a sufficient condition to ensure gender equality. But appliances, energy, modern access to modern amenities is at least a necessary condition, if not a sufficient one. So that is, of course, one thing. Mobility is another thing. Access to transport, to public spaces becomes much more important. And this is, now I'm talking about inequality that is seen locally on multiple aspects. You have class, caste and gender inequalities that manifest, and all of those require access to public life in some sense. And that requires infrastructure, public infrastructure that ensures safety, public infrastructure that is available and accessible to everybody. That is something that you can't simply, push aside or postpone because climate change is the most urgent issue. Unfortunately for the poor, both are perhaps equally urgent, and one cannot necessarily be postponed for the sake of the other.
Sure. So just to put the question further, do we need to unbundle the consumption patterns? You were talking about the rich and the poor and the difference in consumption, and you were talking about persuading the rich to move towards more energy efficient systems, right? And do we need to unbundle at a city scale for city planners to design better vis-a-vis energy and design better vis-a-vis climate change, both from a mitigation perspective, which is what we're talking about, but also from an adaptation perspective?
Yes. Just to set context for that, like historically, if you see the human development index, if you plot human development index versus energy per capita or consumption, it goes up and then it plateaus, like after 100 gigajoule per capita. And a lot of developed countries are beyond that,
right,
beyond 100 gigajoule per capita. They are somewhere from 100 to 300. So there's a good argument to be made that to tell developed countries saying you can stop at 100 gigajoule per capita, which gives a very good, very high HDI, and you're living off the excess energy for the developing countries.
So Rajesh, would it make sense to develop some kind of a HDI and this equivalent energy at a city scale just to understand things better as to how cities can be designed to be more equitous?
Yes, so this will apply to city scale as well.
Correct.
So this also is at a country level. But yeah, it will apply to city scale, and also if you design good public infrastructure, especially you take Bangalore, metro has come too late. I think many people will agree with that. So if metro had been well developed and well mapped out, probably people in the gated communities also would have used metro,
right,
instead of them buying SUVs. And now we have an SUV explosion in the last, 4 or 5 years in Bangalore, which has caused more traffic congestion, parking problems, etc. So just the timing of the public infra has made a big difference, in Bangalore at least.
Sure.
So
one argument just before, Rajesh, sorry for interrupting you, it was that buses are much more democratic and just than the metro itself. The metro itself is a bit elitist.
Yeah.
It takes more subsidy. But point taken that public transport, it should be the focus from an energy perspective, but also access and livability perspective and employment perspective, right? So that was the point that you were trying to make, right? But Dr. Tejal, do we have the institutions to be able to do this kind of systems thinking at, for example, a metropolitan level? We just have the energy department responsible for power supply, or the KPC, the Power Corporation for it. How do we create the institutional and legal systems to do the systems thinking and push for what you were talking about as equity in terms of energy access?
No, I think the municipality is empowered, in fact, also by the constitution itself to be able to do these kinds of things. The fact that you need to have representation in a municipality, you can't have 20 years of no representation and it being run only by a bureaucracy, then of course things are a problem. But if people have a say in what happens democratically, then it is possible. You need coordination across line departments, across either electricity or road or public infrastructure of other kinds, the metro or buses, etc. A whole range of things. But this is not something that planning and the way in which planning is being done. For example, the fact that you need to have housing close to places of work. Right. It's if you have suburban systems where people live in one corner and work in another corner, that is going to be energy intensive. It is not necessarily the best thing. It is perhaps how metros developed at one point of time. But we have a history in India itself, in Indian cities, where there were employer-provided house. There was housing provided by employers. Even in Bangalore, you have societies, HMT. You have BEL, you have ISRO, you have all kinds of employers, public sector employers and private sector employers providing housing in the past. we seem to have moved away from that kind of way of thinking and moved into this sort of, everybody looks out for themselves kind of way of...
You argued that deepening democracy, especially local governments, is at the heart of doing it. But still, do we need to reimagine our institutions to do this cross-sectoral thinking and to guide systems to be able to be more efficient, both from, let's say, land use planning or housing or transportation mobility and energy, right? Bringing it all together. So what form would it take, and how do we create the architecture of such a system of knowledge building, but also action?
No, I don't have really an answer for what form such an institution would take. I would imagine that, you already need a lot of coordination, for example, between various line departments that are responsible for infrastructure. The metro cannot simply put down its infrastructure wherever it pleases. It has to coordinate with the city, different departments of the municipality. It has to with the road and transport department, with housing departments, etc., etc. I mean, I don't know what exactly they are called in the context of cities, but you need this coordination. Now, the point is that this only happens in a piecemeal manner. When you have infrastructure to be implemented, you coordinate. But because it already happens, there is a basis to actually institutionalize some of this.
Right.
What is it that that over the next 20 years, there's going to be expansion. There's going to be expansion of the road network. You are going to have to think about water supply and sanitation and things like that. So institutionalize, cross-departmental coordination in some ways, have people who work on both aspects of things. This interdisciplinarity, unfortunately, we haven't even really got a hang of how to do it in academia, where it's easier. Everybody thinks that putting people from different disciplines together is interdisciplinarity, but you don't have to inculcate an interdisciplinary way of thinking. So I imagine it will be much more difficult in departments that actually have to do the implementation. But there is, engineers who actually work on the ground are instinctively sometimes or forced to be interdisciplinary because they have to think about various. So perhaps doing this in the space of practice rather than in the space of theory, which is academia, might be easier. I'm not sure it has been attempted maybe something to try out, but I'm not really sure how it works within the legal frame.
Right. So, I just wanted to add, Raj, but you can add on, and I'm sure that your idea of communication dissemination would also try and include messages for the institutions also and the institutional architecture. I'll just give you an example of Bengaluru. When we faced a crisis with water in the 60s, we created the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board, a parastatal, specifically geared towards managing water and sanitation because we found that it needed capacities beyond the local. We had to ship water from 100 kilometers away. So, and that was the first institution of its kind created in India, then followed by others, right? So just to push for Bengaluru and how pioneering it can get. So from a knowledge perspective, and as you rightly articulated, interdisciplinarity is critical, but our institutions are 20th century institutions, and we need 21st century institutions, to put it in simple terms. But you were wanting to add to that argument, Rajesh, and also to say, how do you then devise communications and build narratives on this kind of thinking that we need to fix issues of our city?
Yes, before answering that, just to add to her point, I think now BBMP has dissolved and now Bangalore Development Authority has
Greater Bangalore.
Yeah, and it split into 5 wings. Yeah, I think they will be the ideal one or a good place to take up this institutional architecture and start making a blueprint on it, because they are the ones who will be planning and implementing urban development schemes. So if this gets incorporated, nothing better than that.
So it's a window of opportunity that waits. But governance systems are something that we need to deal with very quickly if we want to solve the problems of the vulnerable. So I just want to push this argument a bit further in terms of the equity and the vulnerable people. How do you think we should get energy justice for these? For this informal sector, those who occupy the most vulnerable places, those who are affected by flooding, migrants who come in, workers with solid waste, liquid waste, and that sector. How do you think we imagine energy access for them?
Yeah, that's a kind of $1 million question.
You have a competition for the Nobel Peace Prize with a certain gentleman, but
yeah. Yes, that's also one part of climate justice. I mean, a core pillar of climate justice, and with the time, what is going to happen is since fossil fuels are depleting, the price of energy will go up, and that price probably will become unaffordable for the lower class, and that is also plays into the energy injustice.
Big challenge, but is that a zero-sum game? And you've been a strong arguer, Dr. Tejal, of the coal idea that we have 300 years of coal with us, and it's a huge. What do we do with it, right? So, are we running out of that particular fossil fuel? And if we're not running out of it, what then? How then do we put that to use to get climate justice?
Yeah, I think we'll run out of atmospheric space far before we'll run out of fossil fuels. So that is the more immediate thing. But I think in terms of immediate solutions for targeting the most vulnerable sections of a city's population is, whether or not the rich reduce their consumption, etc., that's a different story, and I'll come to that in a bit. But I think immediately is the strengthening of public infrastructure, the provision of public infrastructure. For something like, for example, if there is extreme heat stress, where is it that the homeless go? Has to be a primary question that we ask ourselves in the city, that we force governments to ask. If there is flooding, where do those who do not have homes, or those who have homes in low-lying areas, where do they go? There have to be provisions in the city for taking care of these sections of the population. You have public cooling, you have public shelters with cooling, you have housing that is made available to people. The second is all of your workers that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, if we are talking about in the context of climate change in the most immediate sense, or just even weather variability. All the workers that are exposed to the impacts much more directly. Sanitation workers, road workers, hawkers, street workers, people who work directly outside. What is it that we have in terms of solutions for them? It's one thing to say that there are early warnings. You have early warning systems, but how is it that the state responds to an early warning system? We have some examples of how states can effectively respond to cyclone warnings. For example, Orissa is a great example of how it has been done. What is it that we do in the case of flooding, in the case of extreme rainfall, in the case of extreme heat for cities like Bangalore or any other region for that matter? How do we have plans for response in place, ensuring that the most vulnerable are protected in this case?
And ideally, this would be done at a ward level, right? As a democratic exercise where you then do this climate risk audit and you have solutions for the immediate challenges that particular ward faces, because different wards can face different challenges. The city itself is a zone of many vulnerabilities, right? For example, the west of the city is where the garment workers are, or the east of the city is where the dormitories or the paying guest accommodations are, which is a particular housing type, and so on, such challenges. So particularly articulation of solutions should emerge at a local context, which perhaps could be the ward. What would be your thought on that?
To a certain extent, but you may not always have the resources to be able to provide the solutions. Of course, articulation of those concerns must be, but it also sometimes depends on the composition of the ward itself. If you have a lot of gated communities, as they're called in a ward, then you have far more polarization, unfortunately, today. And who controls the narrative of what the ward needs would be very different as compared. We've seen this during COVID, right? What are the solutions for the rich versus what are the solutions for the poor are sometimes at cross purposes. So that, I think, should be taken care of. But I'm coming back to one point of the energy consumption argument. Right. There is, of course, a conspicuous consumption at the very high spectrum of the population. But you take the middle class or the upper middle class in India, just the structure of consumption is very unlike the structure of consumption even in the middle classes and the lower middle classes in some of the developed countries, especially in Europe and the US. I mean, it's not as if cars, of course, have become almost ubiquitous, but in these classes. But things such as amenities that are used at home, where you get your food from, per capita consumption, floor space, access to how much area you live in, is still, even in the middle and upper middle classes, quite lower as compared to developed countries. So whether a reduction in energy consumption, and again, it's not a zero-sum game. We tell our children that, if you waste food, if you don't waste food, somebody else will not go hungry. That's an argument to be made, perhaps, to convince a child to not waste food. But unfortunately, public distribution doesn't work that way.
It's a moral argument. It's not a physical argument.
It's a moral argument. It's not. In fact, it's a politically not very useful argument. That is because even if you have enough food, the poor may not get it. And that's really a problem.
Yeah, so it's distributive justice, which is not a resource availability justice, but a distributive justice issue that is at play, right? But to push for Bangalore city, if geology is destiny, we are lucky to be at 900 meters above sea level. We have certain advantages in terms of the weather, in terms of rainfall patterns, in terms of the drainage system settings. So is there a advantage for us in terms of the energy, or a disadvantage for us from an energy perspective?
Not per se.
Not per se.
Yeah.
Because most of our power comes from Raichur thermal power plant.
Yes. And also we have, among other states, we have much more hydro as well.
Correct.
So in that way, from a grid, cleanness or grid going green, I think we are doing good. And since we have hydro, it is more bankable as well with time. But the problem is since all people are coming to Bangalore, energy consumption is going to shoot up. And whether the grid can reliably supply, that is going to be a big question. And probably that's where the grid storage will has to come in, so that to give that 24/7 supply. And we are ramping up the renewable targets, but we are not ramping up the grid storage to complement the renewables. So I think that's one thing which has to be addressed. I mean, for India, especially for Bangalore. Yeah.
So one response for the city, for you, Rajesh, is that we are now looking at EVs or electrical vehicles as perhaps one way of avoiding pollution and emissions. How do you see the EV phenomenon?
Yeah, I would say again, cannot be a total replacement from fossil fuel vehicles because in a way we are shifting problem from one commodity to another, because even for EVs we need lithium batteries, and lithium is still a non-renewable resource, and a lot of mining constraints from lithium, the supply chain constraints, all that will not make a smooth transition. And other aspect is the supply chain also becomes very complex as compared to fossil fuel being delivered to the vehicles. And other aspect of electrification is we need copper. And the copper ore concentration has gone down very rapidly from 10% to like 1%. And that has become more expensive. So all these constraints will play into not we moving to 100% EVs. I mean, it will have a certain percentage, maybe 10 to 20%. But yeah, it's tough to go beyond that, considering our current energy consumption again.
So is it a like-for-like replacement that we are thinking of, and are we limited by our imagination of what alternatives are?
In the transport sector, it is very clear that the solution is public transport. And that should be the first place where we should focus on. There is, EVs have a role to play. And there will be some, shift away from IC engines to EVs, and which is good because it does reduce local pollution. But of course, the electricity comes from coal that is generated elsewhere. So in terms of CO2, there might not be that much of a difference. But local pollution, yes, it does reduce. Maybe we should be focusing on electric buses, on public transport systems that are electric. But the problem of all the other issues that Bangalore faces of congestion, of long, hours of reaching work and things like that are not going to be solved by moving from IC engines to EVs. In that sense, this is one sector where you do have a silver bullet, which is public transport.
Oh, okay. So we have found the werewolf and the silver bullet simultaneously together. Your take on solarization at a domestic level, would you say that people should make that switch?
I think rooftop solar has got a lot of traction in Bangalore.
It's got traction.
Yeah, even in my house also.
Should we make that?
Yes. But again, we have to remember, even they have a limited life cycle, 20 to 25 years. Again,
what do you do with the waste?
Yeah, waste. And at some point, we're already reaching law of diminishing returns on energy, materials. So that is going to put some pressure on, more solarization. Right now is fine, but again, it comes back to the theme of reducing. Right. If we can reduce per capita consumption, the supply can take care of it. So right now the focus is all on supply, not on the demand. So that's what I'm stressing on in my...
Right. So is it the same? If you don't eat food, somebody will be hungry. So if you don't use solar energy...
I think there is the basis for that argument, and it is a very popular argument, that it's simply not possible to keep meeting increasing energy consumption with the resources that you have. So you need to think about reducing consumption. Now the question is whose consumption and which consumption, right? That becomes an issue. And so in Bangalore, in certain sections of society, this argument holds or can be made because, people do have a lot of conspicuous consumption, let's say. But that is a minority, a very, very small minority. We just are too many people. That's why our minority is also about 1 million people. But it is really a minority. A large section of the population in India, in Karnataka and in Bangalore, uses less than they actually should, uses less than they need. And so reducing consumption is not really an argument for them. You can't ask somebody who's starving to go on a diet. And you can't even make a diet plan for somebody assuming that once he starts eating, he will become obese. And so you make a diet plan for that person right now, right? So you have to think about, if you're thinking about that section of the population, then is solarization an answer? Some amount of it, definitely, one must do solar. It depends on what kind of housing you have in some areas, Malleshwaram, etc., where housing looks different also. Perhaps some amount of solar rooftop is possible. In other areas where you have high rises, solar can take care of, common lighting areas and things like that. This should be done. There is no doubt about it. But there is productive use that happens in the city. So it's not just domestic consumption. That's again a small amount. There's a lot of productive use that is required, that you need energy for. Productive in the sense that you use energy to make other products. And for that, a replacement is not as easy as it would be for sort of something like lighting, for example. So it's not a either or conversation.
It's never an either or. But we must recognize that there's a personnel that one can do, but there are structural issues which also need to be addressed simultaneously. It can't be both together. So I just sort of pick the future to end this very interesting conversation. We seem to be imagining our city as a lot of industrial zones. There's an aerospace zone, there's an industrial zone. And we saw also a particular resistance which came from farmers of Devanadi, you would be reading about it, who wanted their land to be kept for agriculture and their own traditional livelihoods. And for the first time, at least in this battle, the farmers won so far, right? But what, therefore, are the battles battle lines that will emerge in Bangalore for the future vis-a-vis our growth and our energy demands? And how do we recognize and make sure that those battles are just and equitable? So in this particular case, one's heart was with the farmers because they wanted to carry out what would be a low energy lifestyle as compared to an aerospace zone, which would be a high energy, high polluting consumption, but which would have given the image of the city as an economic powerhouse. So how does this economic powerhouse, the livability and the energy arguments merge in the future of Bangalore?
Yeah. The nature of the city is that it has, its economic activity is structured in a way that is, as of today at least, not necessarily nature-based. So in that sense, it's either industrial or commercial and things like that. That is simply how we define urban regions as well. So you have far less in that sense. With all the urban farming, urban greening, all of this put together also, the very purpose of the city is to provide goods and services that are not provided by areas that are not cities. And this is historical. It's not just about Bangalore, for that matter. You have once you have division of labor, this is what happens. And so it is simply the nature of the city. The question is, however, the disempowerment that comes with industrial expansion, historically that has happened, is not a given. It doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to have industrial expansion or industrialization or modernization at the cost of other people. One doesn't necessarily have to happen at the cost of something else. That is how it has happened historically. That doesn't necessarily mean it is how it must happen. So, are there ways in which city development can be thought of in a much more inclusive manner? You are going to have workers coming in. As agriculture becomes either more productive and labor gets released from agriculture, or because of distress. So whatever other reasons of migration, either short term or long term, people do migrate to cities. It is going to grow. But how can this be much more equitable, much more just? In what way do you... So you don't think about cities simply as large, shiny areas of, big buildings, glass buildings everywhere, but as much more inclusive, equitable and democratic spaces where people can in fact enjoy the benefits of modernization that the countryside does not offer. Women, for example, have many more freedoms in cities that women in rural areas do not. And so if that is a benefit of the city, how is it that you maximize that benefit is something that must be at the center of how we think about
or metropolitan areas. So thanks for bringing Karl Marx and Ambedkar both in the argument together simultaneously. That was very nice to hear from. Just a future prognosis from both of you to close it. Bangalore is 14.5 million today. I see a Bangalore which will be 50 million people. Do you agree with that forecast or not?
I don't agree with the forecast. I feel
you don't agree with the forecast, or you don't agree with the idea of the forecast?
I mean, what I meant was at some point there is going to be reverse migration to the towns because
you think it'll become so unlivable?
Yes, it's going to be unlivable.
Great. What do you think, Dr. Tejal?
I don't think so. I don't think it'll be unlivable. 50 million, I don't know. But, a city anywhere above 20 million, you have to think about it as the city has to have a separate status.
Right.
It cannot be, we have to think about different ways of governing cities that are larger than that size. We do have problems that you've seen. Of course, Delhi is perhaps an example that has gone far beyond that number. Mumbai also is 24 million, I think, right now. So you have to think about it. But this idea somehow that only that will change, that people will change, there will be more people, but everything else will remain just the same, I think is too pessimistic. I think there is scope for optimism. You just have to make sure that we are organized enough as a people to be able to effect the kind of changes that we want. And that requires work from all sections of society in the city. It can't simply be left to those who are the most vulnerable. They have the most difficulty organizing as well. So the change can happen, but it has to be made to happen.
Right? So on that particular optimistic note, we'll end this very interesting conversation. One is sure that the city will become unlivable and there will be reverse migration. The other sees us to be designing our cities to be inclusive, to be able to accommodate what can be and to make it more livable as it goes along. Just a reminder that Bengaluru currently is around 800 square kilometers in land area, which is the Greater Bangalore Authority. But the Bangalore Metropolitan Regional Development Authority plans for 8,005 square kilometers. So which is the Bengaluru that we will have in the future will all depend on how we work out policies and our plans to be able to be inclusive and just and welcoming and make the city more livable. So thank you both for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹೇಗಿದ್ದೀರಾ ಆರಾಮಾ
ಒಂದು ಕಾಫಿ ಅಣ್ಣ